everybody. Welcome back. I already saw one comment from Jacob. Intro music is fun. Well, thanks. That's the stock StreamYard intro music. I made it myself. No, I'm just kidding. Welcome back, everybody. I'm glad that we're all here. Just to give a little recap and an intro, we're doing a series of 6 live stream discussions here on this channel where we're talking about just various things regarding religion, culture, our generation, which would be me, millennial, and then maybe some other Gen Z and other people of our general age bracket, what our experience is with Christianity mostly, but just religion in general, and how it actually applies to our lives, whether that's for the good or for the bad. We all kind of have different beliefs and different backgrounds, and some agreements, some disagreements, but that's why we're here. I just wanted to have a place where people could share honestly about their beliefs, because one of the things that I've noticed over and over again in the last, well, really most of my life, is that a lot of people that I know, myself, well, probably not me because here I am publicly podcasting left and right, but most people that I know have a lot of thoughts and questions, but they're afraid or unwilling to talk about it in public. So that's why I wanted to do this series. And we're trying to get a couple of other people hopping in with us from time to time. The core 3 are me and Manly and Stephanie. And tonight we have my friend Eric, who I'll introduce to you in a second. But I also just wanted to let everybody know that you can watch this either on YouTube or on Facebook. We're streaming it and then you can play it back. But also I'm uploading the audio version to my podcast RSS, which you can find anywhere you get podcasts: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, etc. I had somebody in the comments on YouTube had said they would rather listen while they work out than watch it on YouTube. So if you prefer that, I usually upload it the next day to the audio stream. So you can download it there and just listen however you want. And then what was the other thing? Oh, I just wanted to say thanks to everybody who's been showing up and chatting in the comment section. It's been fun to interact with people, and yeah, hopefully we'll have some more people tonight. But if not, we'll have a good discussion. So we'll do quick intro. Maybe I think most people hopefully know Stephanie and Manly, but I want to give a little intro for Eric. Eric and I met, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 years ago now, something like that. We met in another online community that we both followed, a political podcast, and they had some local meetups for followers in different areas. And we met up that way and hung out a little bit when we both lived in Southern California and became friends. And then when I moved, and then he eventually moved too, he would come to my Zoom game nights, and we've just stayed in touch since then. But he is a sort of differing voice, and I'll let him explain a little bit more about himself and what his background is.
Hey everyone, I've been catching up on all of your episodes. Your podcast has been very interesting, and I'm happy to be on it. God, where do I start? So, all the way back at the beginning. My father grew up with very conservative Christians, Pentecostal holinists in rural North Carolina for the first 7 years of his life. But then a lot of the turbulence. Oh, I should say before I continue, I have a stutter. If you hear any turbulence on the part of my own voice, that is what you're hearing. Don't worry, it's not nerves. Well, it's probably nerves a little bit, but so he.
Don't worry, we can follow along.
You got it right. So he, after a series of events that were largely created by his biological mother, came to kind of hate religion. And my theory is that he was given the values of his religious upbringing in those first 7 years, which is what linguists call the critical period. And then he decided he was against religion, and so I had a kind of like a American upbringing, I guess you'd call it. There was Christmas and Easter, no Jesus, and I tell religious friends that, and they're like, "What? How does that work?" And so at some point, I found my way back to seeking in the context of politics, because politics and religion, the two things that you're not supposed to talk about at parties, are fundamentally tied together, I think. And that's how I'm here.
Awesome. Cool. Well, we'll get into it a little bit more. But I'm curious if you could give a little bit. Have your beliefs evolved at all over time, or would you say that you've had a good sense of your beliefs and they haven't changed that much?
Oh God. So my beliefs have been on a roller coaster in I think probably in like as a young child, I believed in Santa Claus. I can say that. And then in high school, I flirted with atheism quite a bit, although I had a vision of hellfire, interestingly enough, as I contemplated some of the darker parts of my growing up experience. And I think that that's partly because being almost 40, I was raised on Hollywood movies like Robin Williams and what dreams may come, for example, where his wife ends up in hell because she
that's a trippy movie.
Yes, it
if
is.
Anybody hasn't seen that, you should watch it.
And then he has to go down and rescue her, and then as I got into college, I was with a rather religious Jew, and I had to put like a scientific spin on spirituality. So I thought about all of the concepts that Christians do as like energies and quantum entanglements and all that kind of thing. And now I would say I have a wish to be more Christian than I actually am, because I think it's helpful for rationality in some senses, which is a strange thing to say, perhaps. But I see the benefits of having that kind of foundation intellectually.
Yeah, that makes total sense. That is an interesting thing that I have been thinking about for a few years and haven't quite come to a conclusion on, because on the one hand you have like, okay, just me starting out, I'm so like all possibilities and all ideas are open for consideration, that I don't try not to ever take a really hard stance on anything, because like I even have an email address that's like, you don't know that, because in my mind you can't ever know anything for sure. So but with that being said, I do think that my tendency, having come from a religious background, is to point out the possible flaws and the possible detriments there, going this direction. But you can also see them coming the other direction, coming from like a secular or a non-religious background, pointing out the bad possibilities of that, and coming down. It's difficult for me to say like point blank whether one or other is better or worse for any particular person. Do any of you guys have a thought on that concept of like, okay, I'm willing to definitively say, despite its flaws, Christianity is a better worldview or a better rubric for life, or despite its flaws, secular or non-religious worldview is a better rubric for life. And while you guys think about that, I just want to shout out to all of the viewers. Hey, Ian. Hey, Rose. And then Travis. Welcome. We're glad you guys are here. Chime in, too, if you guys have thoughts along the way. So anybody have any thoughts about what I just said? Go ahead.
I think that the major religions typically do have a lot of positivity, and I think positivity inspires motivation, which inspires us to problem solve and to grow. So, like, basically withstand healthy stress. So I think that that is easier to access when you have a pre-made worldview than when you have to make it yourself. So
it saves you like brain power and stress and time and energy, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So would you say that it's less important, the inherent, like, a truth of such a worldview more than it just is there?
Can you rephrase the question? Sorry.
Like, if it's better to have a preset worldview that's compounded over many people thinking about it over time and building it up and into a culture, is that just the important part, or is it also important for that to be somehow true?
Well, I guess that depends on the person. I definitely think the truth matters more than, I guess, anything. But for a lot of people, they just want tools to survive more so than answers.
Yeah.
So,
okay, yeah. So I would kind of agree with that. Like, if you like the idea that some people don't need or want it necessarily to make perfect sense logically. They just need a framework to live their life by. And then some people, probably I would argue you and I, have a larger need to like work it out for ourselves. Even if there's a pre-existing sort of rationale, we want to check it and then rebuild it from our own point of view, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Especially because I think that pre-existing one isn't perfect ever. So it's like up to us who are willing to kind of break it down and kind of reframe or restructure.
Although I also do think there is value in sort of the condensed and distilled wisdom over time of many people thinking about the same concepts over history and writing about it and talking about it and all that. So I guess that's partly why we're here, because we could all just go away to our little hole and think about it ourselves, but we want to bounce it around together. Nice. We have a couple of comments here. Jacob says, I wouldn't say one worldview is healthier or better than another. I think it's primarily dependent on how that worldview is expressed. Okay, that is a fair point. My own instinct is to say that there is some objective truth to be uncovered in the world, but how you get to it or how you express it, like you said, it looks very different for different people. So maybe we're saying the same thing, maybe we're not. See, everything is nothing at the end of the day. I'm not a relativist, but it might sound like it sometimes by the way I talk, because nothing is definitive.
Jacob, thank you for your comment. I think that that we have to probably have some kind of metric on world views in the sense of like there must be bad ones, right? It's not to say that like Catholic versus Protestant. Oh, one is clearly bad and the other not. No, it's not that. It's like, if you believe that that there's a certain ethnic group that should not be on the planet anymore, like that would probably be a bad worldview, right? Regardless of exactly how it's expressed, although if it's expressed in a totally uh, benign way, that would be interesting. And
that would be funny. A whole worldview that's totally benign. That would be like, I believe in the Care Bears or something. Even then, you have something. Caring is not that benign, I suppose. But yeah, that's a good point. Although I would draw a distinction here. In my mind, like, if you could take a worldview purely based on its cold rationality, and then to bring in Jacob's point about depending on how it's expressed, that's now we're bringing in like a value judgment, right? Because it could be expressed any which way, but the implication or the implicit thing there is that depending on how it's expressed, it could be good or bad. Like there's some kind of value there. So I think there are two separate pieces, because you could have just a totally rationalistic worldview. Like that's where the Marquis de Sade really went with its whole philosophical delve into sadism, where if you follow the logic of it all the way down, it's basically do as thou wilt, right? And how you express that, most of the time, people, generally speaking, people would make a value judgment that that's bad. So it's interesting to separate the two concepts of like a logically consistent and internally consistent worldview versus the value judgment of like whether it's a good one or a bad one. Good comment. I think we'll probably come back to this when we talk a little bit more about morality and stuff. Travis says having a worldview and taking time to develop what yours is helps to connect a person's beliefs. Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's both the experience for people who grow up in the church, and then whether they stay or not. If you stay, at some point you have to take it on. Well, you don't have to, but it's probably a good idea if you take it on as your own belief system in the process, understand what that means to you and develop your own perspective on it, which a lot of people, I won't go so far as to say people do or don't do that. They can decide that for themselves, but I think that is an emphasized point. A lot of Christians like to say stuff like, oh, God has no grandchildren, just children. It's the idea that like everybody has to come to God on their own. They're not just grandfathered in. But then on the flip side of that, a lot of people in trying to tie their beliefs together for themselves end up sort of like outside the fold, as it were. And that's like, that's scary for a lot of people who want to stick with the provided wisdom or have fear of like, people being lost or something. Cool. Thanks, Travis. All right. So going back to our question about morality, one of the things that I've been wondering about is maybe this is something we can all get on the same page about, because it seems implicitly we all do think that there is some kind of moral order to the world. There is good and bad. There is some kind of moral code to the universe. So traditionally speaking, religious people and Christians especially believe that moral code is derived from God. But if you happen to be a person who doesn't believe in God, one, can you get to morality without God? And two, if you can, how and what does morality look like?
I have some thoughts on that.
Okay.
I think 100% you can get to quote unquote morality without God if morality is defined as behaving in a way that a society can successfully move forward and evolve in a positive direction. I think it's easy to prove that you can do that without directly saying, I believe in God. Now, I think it'd be intellectually dishonest to say that Christianity didn't take a role in that, or at least Judeo-Christian values didn't take a role, because if you look at how most developed countries and societies came into being, it kind of was through conquer, unfortunately, but it came from a lot of Judeo-Christian values and people coming in and saying, hey, this is how we do things. We don't slaughter. It's ironic because technically it's like, hey, we don't, like, you know, the 10 Commandments, but obviously
Yeah.
we killed people in order to achieve the 10 Commandments, and amongst them. But I think that having a spiritual structure, a religious structure around your belief system and your philosophy to shape your behavior is beneficial. But I'm a fan of saying that science and God are incorporated together, in the sense that I actually believe that God created everything. And if God created everything, then there is a natural order to existence. And if there's a natural order to existence, then that can be studied and probably proven what works the best. And that's not to say that that wouldn't mean to me that God doesn't exist if I can figure out how to be a good person without God. That means God exists and God created everything, and you should be able to figure out how to be a good person without
you
God.
should be able to observe morality whether you know its source or not.
Exactly. And I don't think that some people would say, like, man, that's horrible, that's like heresy. But for me, I'm like, I think God was very smart when he did that, because that means that whether we believe in him or not, we're probably going to try and do something right. I mean,
yeah, well, it would make sense. It would have to follow that if God exists, I mean, assuming it's a rational God, then the world that we live in would follow by some sort of logic or some sort of setup. However, there was another point that I was going to make, which has just recently flown from my mind. So if anyone else wants to jump in, I'm going to try to recall it, but go for it.
Yeah, I'm you know, the stories that you hear talking about, like, Christianity being kind of a conquering force, you know, that's certainly evidently true as we look into history. And I think that comes partly. So my bachelor's is in pre-medical science, general science, and I have some subspecialties there. And I'm very interested in cell theory, spread theory, primarily, as it comes from that kind of thinking. And so you look to you know, like Jewish people who decided that they were not going to proselytize, right? But that keeps the population small, necessarily. And Christians who have a policy of
or like Muslims too.
Yeah, exactly. And there's much more global spread. And then, you know, of course, you get the clash of civilizations as the Christians come up against the Muslims.
Right.
But you get, you know, some of that spread does happen by the sword, and some of it happens by gentle and convincing conversion. And like when we got into the Celtic nations as an example, and we said, oh, by the way, thou shalt not kill, you know, as the Christian missionaries did. Apparently, they encountered cultural resistance to that idea, because it was like, no, I'm a big, strong Celt, and I'm going to use that to get what it is that I want. And that was the policy of those cultures. And so this, you know, it's sort of cracks the idea of universal natural morality to some extent.
Yeah. I think it is very difficult to come to the conclusion that there is not some kind of universal morality. Because, well, for one, most people subscribe to a morality, whether they like to admit it or not. Of course, we're coming in this country and in this time and place, we're coming from a Judeo-Christian background and philosophical bedrock. So, of course, we would say, like, for example, killing is a bad thing and all that kind of stuff. But to Manly's point earlier, it is possible to reach a conclusion where you realize, for the betterment of society, at the very least, you should adhere to something like "thou shalt not kill." Although many societies, until modern society, never picked up on that at all. There was not much sanctity of life pre the rise of Christianity, basically. So you might be able to also argue on twofold. This was the point that I was gonna make earlier, Manly, is like, you might be able to what we were saying earlier about rationality versus value judgment. I think it is possible to rationalize your way to a value system, like partially or completely what is expressed in the 10 Commandments. But it is also true that you have, in the course of history, a lot of not adhering to any of that and never reaching it until Christianity and a received morality from God brought it. And we also see in modern America and the modern post-Christian world that sort of unraveling too as people leave Christianity. So I would say you could reach the morality, the Christian morality, or any kind of framework for morality from a rational standpoint, and it could have a good value judgment, but will that actually play out over time is another question that you have to ask, I think.
I think if you have a true or false statement, I would say it's true that if someone's highly intelligent and inquisitive and wants to figure out the objective truth of morality and nature, then they could technically. But this is going to be ruthless, but I think probably like 70 to 80%, maybe more than that, people would not do that. I think most people need something implanted into their life. And technically, I think even further, I think most people wouldn't even take on their belief system for themselves. I think most people are behaving a certain way because of the people around them. And I'm just saying this because I've been in Christian circles. I'm still a Christian. And like I said, it sounds kind of ruthless, but if I ask like probably the vast majority of the Christians I know, like, why do you believe what you believe? Why do you think this is true? Why do you think this is true? Like, well, if the answer would be, for someone that would consider themselves an intellectual that's analytical, like it would be like, oh, you have no idea why you believe anything you're believing right now. I'm glad you're not out here murdering people because your friends don't murder people. But what if your friends murder people?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, you'd probably just say.
I mean, if I'm being totally honest and I look like straight into my soul, if I didn't live in a culture where the Christian inherited morality was the universal accepted morality, I would find it very easy to rationalize, take what I want for my purposes, even at the expense of human life,
Yeah. Because everybody else is at that point.
Yeah.
Also doing it, right?
Yeah. It's like if you could take it one notch lower than like, let's just kill everybody. If you look at other countries, for example, that are not the United States, corruption is so rampant that you basically most people just end up using bribes and doing whatever, engaging in whatever the corruption is, because if you don't, you will be taken out, and I think that's right. I think that's another hazard of like the sort of social aspect of morality that you were just talking about.
100%.
And my view of morality is kind of like, I think it emphasizes behavior too much, especially even if I were to consider it from a Christian lens, just because we're not supposed to be the ones earning heaven. It's supposed to be a gift that we accept. And so I don't even like the words good and bad because it also seems to emphasize that. It seems more like health versus unhealth. Like healthier people just naturally make better or more moral decisions. Like hungry people are going to commit more crimes than not hungry people. And it's just a matter of like if they feel like they have everything they need, it's a lot more likely that they're going to give. And maybe if they don't have a structure or an ideal where that's the case, that might not happen. But like if they have this general idea of, oh, that's the good thing, they also have to be healthy or in some sort of good place themselves in order to make that natural or sustainable.
Yeah, I agree with that. Oh, go ahead, Eric.
So I'm curious to about this idea of like poverty creates criminality, and I think to some extent that is true, but I think about the people who were in like the worst conditions of their life, like people in the death camps at in the Holocaust, and how some of them chose to do bad and some of them did not, and the separator in those two populations seem to be faith, and that I think is an important consideration as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think I think part of like what makes people feel like they have enough or not isn't always like the tangible food, for example. It might also be the community or the reward of the relationship. So if they have faith in a relationship, that's their food, I guess you could say.
Yeah,
where
right.
they value.
I would say to the poverty aspect when you're talking about people who have their needs met or who are healthy. It also applies to like your mental state, your attitude, your emotions. If you're not healthy there too, it's going to cause problems, which I think we see, I think we see that a lot nowadays. I think one of the, in such a sort of decadent society that we live in, one of the prevailing problems is the mental health aspect of our lives, and where that we become deficient in that, we start to see stuff just like crumble away. Okay, we have a couple more comments here. Rose says, what are your thoughts on the duality between good and evil? Is a non-dual approach useful? Okay, that's a good question. You might have to explain a little bit more what you mean about duality here, but I'll take a stab at it. I guess the idea of like a binary of things could be good or bad, versus reframing whatever it is to be different than either a good or a bad. Maybe something like that. My inclination is to say that that there is a duality. I think that like if you're taking, there's now here's where I get in over my head. I think in like Taoism, maybe it's the yin and the yang, where there's good and evil balanced, and like you need both, to balance the universe. I think that concept makes sense in many ways, but I don't think it's actually true. I do think that there are ways that there is a good and a bad duality, and it is possible for one to exist without the other. Like you don't need in perpetuity both to exist to balance, if that makes sense. If I'm not answering your question, you can clarify. Anybody else have anything on this one?
Well, it's kind of a spectrum, right? I mean, it's not just good and evil. It's sort of everything in between, and multiple axes can exist simultaneously that way too.
Yeah.
And I wonder too, like, okay, you're good.
No, you go ahead. No.
Okay, are we doing this again? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, I remember my comment this time. Okay, so like in Native American cultures, this is just something I remember from teaching, was that they would tell stories about like the straight path and the crooked path, and it wasn't a bad path, it was just crooked. So it's just like, it's different but not worse. And I think that's an interesting perspective of like, if it's needed for something good to exist. It's like night and day. And even though night might have a negative connotation, it's only showing the distinctness of the two sides.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that is a very, very useful way to look at life, and to be able to get through whatever path you're on, however crooked it may be, to be able to look at it in some new lens or a new way. However, I would still say that objectively, there are some things that are preferred over others and that are quote unquote better than others, whether or not you can find some way that it, that it all works out in the end. As the Christians say, all things work together for the good of those who love God, something like that.
Yeah, I have a thought on this as well. I think when if we make questions like this too abstract, it becomes really hard to find an answer. But for me, I like to simplify things and make them kind of down to earth and ask myself, like, okay, on like a more practical scale, like how could I ask myself this question? And then I try to think of the extremes, like, okay, what's the worst thing you could think of that no one would say it's not evil? Like raping a young child. Is there ever a way you could say, oh, that's good? Or, I love having a non-dual perspective on raping a child. Like, what's the good in this? How could we see the good in this? And maybe a freak could find the good in it. Like, oh, that person's going to be stronger now because they got raped.
Or like, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, something weird. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that even though it's a visceral argument, like it's like, okay, yeah, probably like you could come at it from a non-dual approach and find a way to make things good. And some people that helps them to maintain sanity. But technically, I think a non-dual approach is more of a weakness. I think that it's like, if you really want to find the objective truth, admit that things are wrong and find a way to work through it in an objectively true fashion, even though it's harder work.
Yeah.
I think ultimately long-term, it's going to make more sense and it'll be more consistent with creating a better world, because a non-dual approach to children being raped is like, you're not going to have the full force of saying it's wrong that children get raped or anything else along that lines. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for bringing us back to concrete reality. The way that I've heard that it's a, what am I trying to say? Oh, well, forget the context. Another way that you could say it is it better to give a beggar a loaf of bread than to curb stomp a child? Like if you were to ask any person of those two things, is one or the other better? You would have.
Yes.
Well, from a non-dual perspective, I can see the
on.
benefits. Either way.
Well, that's the problem. I mean, to the non-dual morality in some contexts sounds nice, and in those gray areas, I think it's more applicable. But I don't think anybody actually lives with non-dual reality. That they always have some things that are like, oh, well, this is actually very good, and this is actually very bad, despite their overall proclaimed worldview.
Yeah, but I think I kind of am not that dualistic about it. Like, so for example, from this example, and even like in my field, I have to counsel people who do things like that. And like, we have to have unconditional positive regard to do it. And so the way I look at it too is like, everybody has like neural connection issues that we cannot understand, and that the innate desires came from something that worked in a different context. So the sexual desire, that worked in a context. That person's desire for connection works in a context. The fact that he used it to rape a little girl, I mean, that is viscerally something you just want to defend and things like that. But I feel like also there is a brokenness. It's like maladaptive. So it's like, I don't want to call it, even though of course it's bad, but like, if I were to help that person, it wouldn't be to say do better, because there's so much going on that this person can't overcome. He knows there's consequences. It's like there are good things in him that are used in a bad way. So to me, that makes it not dualistic.
Yeah, I can see that point of view. And I do think it is very useful in the face of painful or damaging things that you can't change or are thrust upon you or are very difficult to change. It is useful to be able to look at it in a less dualistic perspective so that you're able to not either spiral or like blame yourself or blame others, or to just get out of the trapping feeling that has. But yeah, I do think there is something to be said for at base some kind of objective morality. Good question. Okay. Jacob says, doesn't sanctity of life predate Judeo-Christian values with karma and Eastern religions? I wouldn't be surprised. I guess you could say, although they do in Eastern religions, I'm not so sure if in religions or just in Eastern culture in general, there's a lot of like honor killings and stuff like that. I don't know too much about this. But I guess my point was more to say that the proliferation of this value across the world was brought by Judeo-Christian values, which in a vacuum, in absence of those, something else might have brought it. You know, I'm not saying that it's possible, but yeah, I don't know enough about that. But he did say,
And
I did some quick
Judeo part. I'm sorry, Emily.
Yeah. I did some quick Googling before the comment, and it seemed true at the surface, but I don't know if karma is 1500 BCE is the same as karma now. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that either, but maybe I'll do some Googling.
Eric was going to make a good Judeo point, I think, about ancient history.
Yes. So the Jewish calendar is actually about 6,000 years old. So that's something that fits into the calculation too about the ancientness of this moral framework. Yeah, true. If you're following back all the way back to the very beginning, that would be in one of the main veins of world philosophy and world religion. Okay. More dumb questions. No question. Well, some questions are dumb, but probably yours aren't.
No.
If there is a duality, then who decides what is good and bad? Is that what religion is for? Well, I would say it depends on what you mean by what religion is for. Meaning, in order to dictate what's good and bad, I would say no. In order to more easily discover and reveal what's good and bad, probably, in my opinion, yes. Because if you, like I said earlier, I'm not a relativist, though it might sound like it from the way that I talk sometimes, because I'm so reticent to like take a hard stance on anything, because I'm always considering the possibility of looking at it from a different angle. However, I do think that if you spend enough time at it, what Manly was saying earlier about realizing that what the mechanics of the reality that we live in have rules built into them that reveal what's good and bad, regardless of what religion you take on. I think it becomes self-evident if you can look at it closely enough. And within that truth, that fits in with my personal views on religion and my personal views on God. So those two things fit together. And from that perspective, religion is like a lens or a magnifying glass to what is good and bad. But I don't think it's necessarily determining what is good and bad. It just is based on how the world is created, or how the universe is created or exists. Anybody else? That was really good. Oh, yeah, I wanted to say the duality of good and bad that we've been discussing. Stephanie, I can see where you as a therapist, it's critical for you to be able to empathize with
all of your clients, and no matter what they've done. And that is a skill that I think all of us should have to some extent. And I think that the only other side of the calculation is that we have to be able to, at some point, make the judgment: is this a good thing to do or a bad thing to do? And it sounds like you have, because you described it as maladaptive. Is that fair?
Yes, because it's maladaptive, it's a sign of sickness. So he needs healing, but I wouldn't say like bad dog do better kind of thing. I don't think people are that simple.
Yeah, and I do think even to the point of having empathy and understanding for people who have those wounds and those maladaptive behaviors, it requires some kind of at least implied adherence to a moral order, because if not, then there would be no problem to just say, I personally don't like it, so off with your head type of thing. The fact that we're driven to some kind of trying to view what people do in a charitable and understanding way is like acknowledging some kind of moral order.
So I guess my question is then, does morality come first, or does what works or what doesn't work for someone come first?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do you have an opinion, or are you asking us?
Well, I always have an opinion, but I am asking.
Okay,
also.
Launch into your opinion then.
Yeah, I guess I feel like morality is built around what helps people bloom and like what helps people grow and create a society. And what breaks societies apart is what becomes what's maladaptive. Like we are naturally made to live in a community and to help each other survive. And if there's an action that is being used in a context that is incorrect, that's going to break that apart. And I think that like morality is just our social way of communicating that to each other so that we can make this work.
Okay, that makes sense to me. I would say that, would you go so far as to say that in collective agreement, societies can create their own morality?
I think that, I guess that morals are relative to the values of that community, and it could change depending on the resources available in that place. Mm-hmm. Like, let's say, like having less kids is a lot more valuable to people with less space or less resources, whereas people who are fighting animals in the wilderness or working the farm need more kids. So mm-hmm. maybe like not having sex before marriage is not the same weight in that community versus another. So I think there are examples where morality can be relative. Whereas maybe there are some things that just don't work ever. So that would just be a commonality.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And I don't want to completely disagree with it because I think that oftentimes, because it's difficult to use your brain and noggin, myself included, it's hard to really take apart all of the variables and all of the nuances of something so that you could say objectively something is good or bad. However, I would say my instinct, and I can't prove this because I can't prove anything, is that if you took 1,000 societies and let them play out in similar or different conditions over time, you would see a revelation or a pattern of certain moral codes that play out over and over and over again in those societies, even if they were isolated.
I agree with that. And on Stephanie, on the token that you're talking about, first off, I think your position is super important. The thing that you do is really important. I don't know if there's too many things I'm more passionate about than this concept of restoring the people that are struggling the most in society, which I would describe as the people, like someone like what we're talking about. Like, and I think it takes more effort, and I think it takes more effort to empathize with. And also I think there may be nothing more important than helping the people that are in that state, because I don't think we're going to achieve the more ideal world that we want until we figured out how to help the least of these. And in my opinion, the least of these are the people that are doing what society would consider the worst evils and maybe not knowing why, or maybe even being confident of them knowing why. And it sounds horrible. I think that you would agree with me when I say I think that probably there's people, we need to help these people a lot more than we just need to send them to the freaking electric chair, like a lot of people would say. That's pretty stupid in my opinion, because obviously we have a reason why they pop up, and killing people isn't the solution to solving the problem long term. But for me, the answer to that would be, instead of like changing my foundational philosophy is like, of, hey, there's probably a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things, or at least a more right way and a less right way. Instead of saying certain things are okay to make myself be okay, I would say, no, that's wrong. But grace exists, which is a very fundamental aspect of the Christian belief system. If it's done correctly, I think grace would be, I know you did probably one of the most wretched things that could exist, but guess what? You're loved anyways. You deserve a life anyways. I'm going to do everything possible to help you have a good life. And that's what God did for you. That's what Jesus did for you. It doesn't matter that you raped a kid, or technically it does matter, but that doesn't mean that you don't deserve a path to restoration, which I think is that's where a lot of people struggle. Is they're like, oh, this thing can be the worst thing ever, and we still have to fight for the goodness of that person. Yeah, that's the beauty of what this is. And that's what's, I think, mentally transformative, is when someone realizes, oh, I've done a bunch of bull crap, but I still deserve everything good on this belief system. Wow, that's transformative to my mental state. Like those neurons, I've seen people that like their life was effed up and they're like, wow, I deserve good things anyways. God loves me anyways. I deserve love and forgiveness and a good life. And something about that belief system in and of itself is transformative to our mental state. I don't think it always does the right thing immediately, because I think it takes a very real understanding. But I think a lot of these people, you've probably seen it, but I would imagine there's a lot of people that they come in to see you and they've gotten judgment and shame from everyone else. And then you're like, hey, you deserve love. And they're like, holy F. And then it probably begins to transform them in a certain way. And I would say that's a Christological love that you're giving them, that a lot of Christians aren't doing right, because if they were, then the world would be like, whoa, why is this person such a good person? I'm a douche and they love me anyways. Instead, we're like, hey, you suck. You're going to burn in hell. And they're like, yo, this doesn't sound great to me. I don't
Jacob has an interesting comment on this topic too in the chat.
Yes, I'll bring it up in just a second. But to piggyback on what Manly was saying, I love that, and I agree with that 100%. And I think there was, if you guys ever read the book called, what book is it in? I think it's called The God-Shaped Heart, by a psychiatrist named Tim Jennings. He talks about studies that show that people who meditate on God regularly have increased mental health, and that people who meditate on a God of love and forgiveness have even more increased mental health. So just the practice itself, devoid of any belief system of meditation, can help you. But if you actually believe in a God who loves you and forgives you, then it will have an even bigger benefit. Okay, let's keep going. I think this is my dad. Hi, Dad. It says, Jesus said the universe operates by love. I believe he is right. Everything else is damaging in the long or short run. Yeah, I think that love is a pretty high top line value. Love and freedom are my two top values. Jacob says, I worked for a criminal defense firm for felonies for a few years and talked to a lot of these people, and the majority of the people I dealt with don't even comprehend what they did wrong. Yeah, I think that's probably true. And it goes back to what we were saying earlier of like your surroundings, your culture, your social circle, your brain capacity, all of those different things play into what you understand as good or bad, and what you understand as what you need to do to live and operate, in the world. Okay, cool. We just have a few more minutes here. Do you guys have any rabbit holes that you want to go down or things that you want to talk about to wrap up here?
Well, I'm. Here's a couple of big rabbit holes
Oh,
that
good.
we won't have time for, but I'll just throw them out there. One is I think empathy is critical to a functioning society, and I also think to some extent we rely on a society to keep people from hurting other people, because sometimes they just don't understand, and maybe can't understand why they shouldn't. It's like if you had a button. Sorry to go back to World War II, but if you had a button that could just delete all of the Nazis, would you press it? And if so, is that a lack of empathy on your part? I would say maybe not. So that's rabbit hole number one. Number two, practically speaking, I wonder about things like heaven and hell from a biological perspective. I think that there are other ways that people could experience those, if not just in their own mind. When people are in accidents, as they get close to death, they tend to get time dilated. There was a story about a guy in a motorcycle accident who was able to write a poem to the beat of his helmet bouncing down the road, because he was that time stretched, and he was perceiving way more time than was actually happening. And I wonder if, as people die, they can get time dilated and enter into either their own personal heaven or their own personal hell.
So what you're saying is, in order to time travel, we should wreck our cars.
Yes.
Heck yeah, man. Let's do a mass car wrecking.
No, that is very interesting. I'm interested in learning more about that concept, because I think if anybody's ever had like a high adrenaline, like body shocking experience like that, it does feel like way longer than it is. But yeah, I don't know really much science about that. But that's a great sort of closing brain teaser to close this out on. Thanks for coming, Eric. I really appreciate it. I'm glad that you were able to come and give your perspective. And I just wanted to thank everybody again for joining us, for joining the discussion. As I said at the beginning, this will be available to watch back on YouTube and Facebook, and also tomorrow when I upload the audio to the podcast. So if you want to share it to your friends, there's a lot more to talk about, and I think we're getting to some of the interesting parts. Not that the other ones weren't interesting, but deeper down the rabbit hole is what I say. And hopefully we'll get to some more like contentious things between. So far, I think we've all been fairly, we may have little differences, but fairly aligned in the major areas. We'll see if we can like uncover some of our disagreements along the way. So we'll see you next week. Share this to your friends. And thanks again, everybody. Have a good night.